March 10th, 1989, around noon, Dryden Airport, Ontario. The aircraft sits on the runway edge, while wet snow falls silently from a low gray sky. Inside the cockpit, the engines are alive and humming, and the crew is waiting. Outside, the wings are slowly turning white. No alarms, no warnings, just time passing. But something invisible is already forming on the aircraft, something that cannot be seen from inside. And in just a few moments, that hidden detail will decide whether this aircraft flies or falls. Inside the cabin, passengers are settling into their seats as the delay stretches longer than expected. Some look out the windows watching the snow build layer by layer across the wings. Others are focused on their watches, worried about connections. The aircraft feels normal. Nothing seems wrong, but the silence is deceptive, because at this exact moment, a critical decision has already been made without anyone realizing it. And once the aircraft begins to move, there will be no way to undo it. If you are watching this from somewhere far away, or even near an airport right now, just imagine being on that aircraft in this exact moment. Everything feels routine. Everything feels safe. Yet something has already gone wrong long before the engines even push the aircraft forward. And if you want to understand how situations like this unfold, and why they keep repeating across aviation history, then stay with this story and tell me where you are watching from, because what happened here was not just a mistake. It was a system slowly failing. To understand what really happened, we have to go back to March 10th, 1989, Canada, and to a small airport in northwestern Ontario called Dryden. It was a cold winter day, with temperatures hovering near freezing, and light snow falling from low clouds. Dryden was not a major airport. It was a small regional stop connecting larger cities like Winnipeg and Thunder Bay. But on this day, it became the center of one of the most important aviation investigations ever conducted. The environment that day seemed manageable at first. Snow was falling, but it appeared light and harmless. Visibility was reduced, but not critically low, the kind of weather that pilots encounter regularly during winter operations. But there was something subtle about these conditions. The temperature was just above freezing, and the snowflakes were wet. This meant that any surface colder than the air could turn that moisture into ice instantly. And that detail would soon become critical. The aircraft operating this flight was a Fokker F-28-1000, a twin-engine short-range jet designed to carry around 65 passengers. It had engines mounted at the rear and wings designed for efficient high-speed flight. But like many jet aircraft, it had one major vulnerability. Even a small amount of ice or contamination on the wings could dramatically reduce its ability to generate lift. And unlike turboprop aircraft, the wings of this jet were far less forgiving. The crew flying this aircraft consisted of Captain George Morwood and First Officer Keith Mills, along with 2 flight attendants. Captain Morwood was highly experienced with over 24,000 hours of flight time, but most of that experience came from propeller-driven aircraft. His time on this specific jet was limited. First Officer Mills also had significant experience, but very little on this aircraft type and no simulator training on it at all. Together they formed a crew that was capable but not deeply familiar with the unique risks of this jet. Among the passengers were families heading out for vacations as the Ontario spring break was about to begin. For them, this was just another flight, a routine journey between cities. Some were excited, some were tired. None of them knew that this flight would soon become part of aviation history, and none of them could see the chain of decisions that had already begun forming long before they boarded. Earlier that morning, the aircraft had arrived in Dryden and quickly prepared for departure again. But there was already a problem that had been carried into this flight. The auxiliary power unit, or APU, was not working. This small engine normally provides power and helps start the main engines when the aircraft is on the ground. Without it, the crew would rely entirely on external ground equipment, and that created a limitation that would soon become critical. So why does an inoperative APU matter so much? Because without it, certain procedures become difficult or even impossible. For example, starting engines requires external air supply, and at some airports, that equipment is not always available. That was exactly the case at Dryden. There was no air start unit, which meant that if both engines were shut down, there would be no way to start them again. This created a dangerous workaround. Instead of shutting down both engines during the stop, the crew would keep one engine running at all times. This allowed them to use that engine to start the other later. It seemed practical. It saved time. It kept the schedule moving, but it also created a hidden trap, because some procedures like de-icing cannot safely be performed with engines running. Now this is where the situation becomes critical. Snow was falling at Dryden, and when snow accumulates on aircraft wings, it must be removed before takeoff. This process is called de-icing. It requires spraying special fluid over the wings, but the engines must be shut down before this can be done safely. That meant that if the crew wanted to remove the snow, they would lose their ability to start the aircraft again. At this point, the problem becomes a question. Do you shut down the engine and risk being stranded, or do you keep it running and accept the snow on the wings? And that is exactly the decision that began to form in the cockpit. But the crew did not yet realize the full consequences of either choice. And the system that should have guided them was already failing. The timeline of the day continued to build pressure. The flight was already delayed. Passengers were concerned. The crew had multiple sectors to complete. Every minute mattered. Every delay pushed them further behind schedule. And with the APU inoperative, every turnaround became more complicated. The pressure to keep moving was constant and growing. But pressure alone does not cause accidents. It only influences decisions. So what made this situation different? The answer lies in what the crew believed they were seeing. The snow falling onto the wings looked light and fluffy. It appeared to melt on contact with the ground. From years of experience in turboprop aircraft, this kind of snow often blew off during takeoff, and that belief shaped their perception of the risk. What they could not see was what was happening underneath that snow. Because the fuel inside the wings had been cooled during previous flight segments, that cold fuel lowered the temperature of the wing surface below freezing. So when wet snow touched the wing, it did not just sit there, it froze, instantly forming a thin layer of ice beneath the visible snow. This created a dangerous illusion. On the surface, the snow looked harmless, but underneath it was a rough, frozen layer of ice bonded to the wing. And unlike loose snow, this ice would not blow off during takeoff. It would stay in place, disrupting the airflow over the wing, reducing lift, increasing drag, and pushing the aircraft closer to a stall. But at that moment, none of this was obvious. There were no warnings in the cockpit, no system alerts, only experience and judgment. And that is where the situation became truly dangerous, because the experience guiding the decision was based on a different type of aircraft, a different set of assumptions, and a different environment. So the aircraft continued its preparation for departure. The second engine was started, the checklist was completed, and the aircraft began to taxi. But just as it approached the runway, another delay occurred. A small aircraft was struggling to land in the poor visibility and requested priority. The crew of Flight 13063 had to wait. During those extra minutes, the snowfall intensified. More snow accumulated on the wings, visibility dropped further, and the conditions became worse with every passing second. Yet the decision path had already been set. The aircraft would depart, the schedule would continue, and the consequences of that choice were now only moments away. What happens when a jet aircraft tries to take off with contaminated wings? Why does even a thin layer of ice matter so much? And how did an entire system allow this situation to reach the point of no return? That is where the story begins to unfold in ways no one on board could have imagined. The aircraft lines up on runway 29 as the snow continues to fall. Inside the cockpit, the engines are steady, and the instruments show nothing unusual. From the outside, the wings appear clean enough at a glance, but the truth is layered just beneath the surface. The crew receives clearance. There is no hesitation now. The thrust levers move forward, and the engines respond instantly. Acceleration begins, and the aircraft starts its takeoff roll into a white, blurred runway. At first, everything feels normal. The aircraft picks up speed, and the vibrations from the slushy surface pass through the landing gear. The crew monitors the instruments carefully. Airspeed is building, but something is slightly different. The acceleration feels just a little slower than expected. Not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to sit quietly in the back of the mind. A small difference that no one can yet explain. And as the runway disappears beneath them, that difference continues to grow. So why would contaminated wings affect acceleration on the ground? Because the drag created by uneven airflow over the wings does not just impact lift in the air, it also increases resistance as the aircraft moves forward. The engines must work harder to push the aircraft through the disturbed airflow. This reduces performance before the aircraft even leaves the ground. But inside the cockpit, this effect is subtle. There is no clear indication, only a feeling that something is slightly off. The aircraft continues to accelerate down the runway. Decision speeds approach. The point at which the crew must either continue the takeoff or reject it is passing quickly. And at this moment, there is still no clear reason to stop. The aircraft reaches rotation speed. The captain gently pulls back on the control column. The nose lifts. The aircraft should now transition smoothly into flight. But instead, something unexpected happens. The aircraft hesitates. It lifts briefly, but then settles back toward the runway. A shudder runs through the airframe. Not violent, but unmistakable. The wings are not producing the lift they should. The aircraft is trying to fly, but cannot sustain it. For a brief moment, it feels as though the aircraft is caught between two states, neither fully on the ground nor fully in the air. And now the runway ahead is rapidly running out. Why would the aircraft fail to climb, even after reaching takeoff speed? Because lift depends on smooth airflow over the wings. When ice or contamination disrupts that airflow, it reduces lift dramatically. The wing stalls at a lower angle than expected. The aircraft can no longer generate enough lift to climb, even though the speed seems sufficient. And this effect can happen suddenly, without warning. The aircraft finally lifts off again, but only barely. It clears the runway, but does not climb. Instead, it remains in a shallow, unstable flight just above the ground. The nose is raised, but the aircraft is not gaining altitude. The engines are producing thrust, but the wings are not responding. From the cabin, passengers feel something is wrong. The climb they expect does not happen. Instead, there is a strange floating sensation, as if the aircraft is struggling to stay airborne. Outside the aircraft, the terrain begins to drop away slightly, but the aircraft does not gain enough height to clear obstacles ahead. Witnesses on the ground see the aircraft moving low and unstable. First, the right wing dips slightly, then corrects. Then the left wing drops. The aircraft is losing control of its balance. Each movement is small but increasing. The margin for recovery is disappearing with every second. Inside the cockpit, the crew is now fully aware that something is wrong. But at this stage, options are extremely limited. There is no time to diagnose the exact problem. No altitude to recover. No runway left to land. Only seconds remain. The aircraft continues forward, but cannot climb. And now the trees ahead are no longer avoidable obstacles. They are directly in the path of the aircraft. The first contact with the trees is sudden. The aircraft clips the top, sending debris into the air. The impact destabilizes the aircraft further. It continues forward, striking more trees, each impact tearing away structure and control. The flight path is no longer controlled. It is now a descent shaped by momentum and damage. And within moments, the aircraft begins to break apart. A fire ignites as the aircraft descends. Flames appear along one side as fuel and structure are compromised. The aircraft finally impacts the ground with force. The wreckage spreads across the terrain. What moments ago was a fully functioning aircraft is now destroyed, and in the aftermath, silence returns to the scene, broken only by fire and debris. For those who survived the impact, the situation becomes a different kind of emergency. Fire spreads quickly. The cabin is damaged. Escape paths are limited. Some passengers manage to get out. Others are trapped. The conditions are chaotic and overwhelming, and within minutes, the post-crash fire intensifies, making rescue even more difficult. Why did the aircraft behave this way during takeoff? Why did experienced pilots continue the departure despite the conditions? And why did no system step in to prevent this outcome? These are the questions that investigators would now have to answer. But the challenge they faced was unlike most accidents, because when investigators arrived at the crash site, they discovered something critical was missing. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder had been destroyed by the post-crash fire. The very tools that normally reveal exactly what happened inside the cockpit were gone. There would be no direct recording of the crew actions, no precise data of the aircraft behavior. Only fragments, only witness accounts, only physical evidence. This transformed the investigation into something far more complex. Without recorded data, every detail had to be reconstructed. Every assumption had to be tested. Every decision had to be examined in context. And what began as a seemingly straightforward accident now started to reveal something much deeper. Because the more investigators looked, the less this appeared to be a simple pilot error. Instead, They began to see patterns, decisions that made sense individually but created risk collectively, procedures that were incomplete, systems that were not fully developed, and a culture that allowed small deviations to become normal. What they were uncovering was not just what happened in those final seconds. They were uncovering everything that led up to it, every choice, every oversight, every pressure that shaped the environment in which this flight operated. And as they followed that trail, the story began to move far beyond the cockpit. What kind of system allows a crew to reach a point where taking off with contaminated wings becomes an option? How many warning signs were missed before this moment? And could this accident have been prevented long before the aircraft ever reached the runway? Those answers would not come quickly, but when they did, they would change aviation safety forever. The wreckage was still smoldering when the first responders arrived. Snow continued to fall gently over the scene, as if nothing had happened. But scattered across the frozen ground were the remains of an aircraft that had failed only seconds after takeoff. Survivors were pulled from the debris while firefighters struggled to control the flames. And almost immediately, one question began to dominate every mind present. How could an aircraft fail like this in such a short time? The investigation began under conditions of uncertainty. Normally, investigators rely on cockpit voice recordings and flight data to reconstruct events. But here, both recorders had been destroyed by the intense post-crash fire. There were no voices to replay, no parameters to analyze, only fragments of physical evidence and the memories of those who had witnessed the accident. And that meant every conclusion would have to be built piece by piece. Investigators first examined the wreckage pattern. The debris field showed a low-level impact with trees before ground contact. This indicated that the aircraft had failed to climb, rather than suffering a catastrophic failure in the air. The angle of impact and distribution of parts confirmed that the aircraft had remained largely intact until it struck the terrain. That pointed to a loss of lift rather than a structural breakup. But what had caused that loss? Witness statements became critical. Several passengers who survived described looking at the wings during the takeoff roll. They recalled seeing patches of snow lifting off the surface as speed increased. But beneath that snow, they described a gray, uneven layer that remained stuck to the wing. This detail became one of the most important clues in the entire investigation, because it suggested that something more than just loose snow was present. Investigators then turned to the weather data. Conditions at Dryden at the time of departure showed temperatures just above freezing with wet snowfall. On its own, this might not seem dangerous, but combined with the temperature of the aircraft wings, it created a very different situation. The fuel inside the wings had been cooled during previous flights at altitude. This meant the wing surface was below freezing, even though the outside air was not. So what happens when wet snow touches a surface that is below freezing? It freezes instantly. Layer by layer, the snow begins to bond to the surface, forming a rough coating of ice. This process can happen quickly and quietly. It does not require extreme cold, only the right combination of temperature and moisture. And that is exactly what existed at Dryden that day. With this understanding, investigators began to reconstruct the condition of the wings. They determined that a layer of ice had formed beneath the visible snow. During the takeoff roll, the airflow removed the top layer of loose snow, but left behind the bonded ice. This created an uneven surface that disrupted airflow over the wing, and that disruption reduced lift to the point where the aircraft could no longer climb. But this explanation raised another question. If the wings were contaminated, why did the crew proceed with the takeoff? The answer did not lie in a single mistake. It lay in a chain of decisions and conditions that shaped the crew perception. To understand that, investigators had to look beyond the final moments and examine everything leading up to the flight. They began with the aircraft itself. The inoperative APU was a critical factor. Without it, the crew could not shut down both engines at Dryden because there was no way to restart them. This forced them into a procedure of keeping one engine running during the stop. And that single decision removed the possibility of proper de-icing. The system had already limited their options before they even landed. Next came the operational environment. The crew was operating a demanding schedule with multiple legs in a single day. Delays had already occurred. Pressure was building to stay on time. Each decision was influenced by the need to keep the operation moving. This type of pressure does not force a specific action, but it narrows the range of acceptable choices. And in this case, it pushed the crew toward continuation rather than delay. Then investigators examined the training and experience of the crew. Both pilots were experienced but had limited time on the Fokker F-28. Their background was primarily in turboprop aircraft, where small amounts of snow did not always prevent takeoff. This experience shaped their mental model of what was acceptable. They believed that the snow they saw would likely blow off during takeoff, but they did not fully account for the behavior of ice on a jet wing. This raised a deeper question. Why did their training not prevent this misunderstanding? Investigators found that the training program for the Fokker 28 at Air Ontario was inadequate. Simulator time was limited. Some pilots had received no simulator training at all. Critical scenarios were not practiced, and the transition from propeller aircraft to jet operations had not been properly supported. The knowledge existed, but it was not reinforced. But even that was not the full picture. The investigation then moved into the organizational level. They examined how decisions were made within the airline. They looked at maintenance practices. They reviewed dispatch procedures. And what they found was a pattern of systemic weakness. Documentation was incomplete. Equipment lists were not properly developed. Procedures were inconsistent, and oversight was lacking. One of the most critical findings involved the minimum equipment list. This document defines what equipment can be inoperative and under what conditions an aircraft can still be dispatched. In this case, the APU had been deferred under an incorrect reference. If the correct reference had been used, the aircraft would not have been allowed to operate into Dryden without proper ground support. The entire sequence of events might have been prevented at that point. Investigators also uncovered a troubling safety culture. Pilots had developed a habit of recording defects on informal notes instead of official logs. This allowed aircraft to continue operating without proper maintenance action. In some cases, pilots who reported issues correctly were discouraged or even threatened. This created an environment where compliance with safety procedures was seen as an obstacle rather than a priority. The role of dispatch was also examined. Dispatchers are responsible for providing accurate information and ensuring that flights meet all operational requirements. In this case, the dispatch system failed to provide critical weather updates. The crew was not informed of freezing precipitation at Dryden. This removed another layer of protection that could have influenced their decision-making. The system that was supposed to support the crew instead left them exposed. As investigators continued their work, a larger pattern emerged. This was not an accident caused by a single error. It was the result of multiple small failures aligning at the same time. Each one alone might not have caused a problem, but together, they created a situation where a normal operation became unsafe. This is often described as a chain, but in reality, it is more like a network of interconnected weaknesses. So the question now shifted, not just what happened, but why was this allowed to happen? Why were these weaknesses present? And why were they not corrected before they led to an accident? To answer that, investigators had to go even deeper into the structure of the aviation system itself. What they discovered would change how aviation accidents were understood, because this investigation was not just about one flight. It was about how organizations operate, how decisions are made, and how safety can be compromised without anyone intending it. And as the investigation moved toward its final conclusions, one realization became impossible to ignore. The crew of Flight 136-3 did make the final decision to take off. But the conditions that shaped that decision had been created long before they ever stepped into the cockpit. So where does responsibility truly lie in a situation like this? And how do you prevent something like this from ever happening again? Those answers would define the legacy of this accident. As the investigation moved toward its final stage, the focus shifted from individual actions to systemic responsibility. Investigators had already established that the aircraft took off with contaminated wings and failed to generate sufficient lift, but that was only the final event. The deeper question was why every layer that should have prevented this had failed, and the answer that emerged was both uncomfortable and transformative. The findings showed that the crew was placed in a situation where safe options were gradually removed. The inoperative APU limited their ability to perform standard procedures. The absence of ground equipment at Dryden eliminated backup solutions. The incorrect application of the equipment list allowed the aircraft to be dispatched into an environment where it could not be properly supported. Each step reduced flexibility. Each step increased reliance on judgment instead of procedure. So why did the system allow this configuration to exist? Because oversight had failed at multiple levels. Transport Canada had approved operations without ensuring that critical documentation like the minimum equipment list was fully developed. This meant that the rules governing safe operation were incomplete. And without clear rules, decision-making became inconsistent. What should have been defined became subjective. The airline itself also played a central role. Air Ontario had expanded into jet operations without building the necessary infrastructure to support it. Training programs were insufficient. Operational procedures were inconsistent, and the integration of different company cultures created confusion about standards. Safety practices that might have been acceptable in a bush-flying environment were carried into a jet operation where the risks were very different. One of the most significant conclusions involved organizational culture. Investigators found that safety was often secondary to operational efficiency. Pilots were expected to find ways to keep flights moving, even when problems arose. Reporting defects properly was discouraged in practice. Informal workarounds became normal. And over time, these practices created an environment where deviations from standard procedures were no longer seen as unusual. This raises a critical question. How does a system reach a point where unsafe practices become normal? The answer lies in gradual change. Each small deviation is accepted because it seems harmless. Each workaround is justified because it solves an immediate problem. But over time, these small changes accumulate, and eventually, the system operates in a state where risk is embedded into everyday operations. The investigation also highlighted the role of communication failures. Dispatchers did not provide critical weather updates. Maintenance did not fully address recurring technical issues. Operational control made decisions that prioritized schedule over safety margins. And each of these failures removed another layer of protection. The crew was left to make decisions without complete information. And in aviation, incomplete information can be as dangerous as incorrect information. Another important factor was the misunderstanding of aircraft-specific behavior. The crew applied experience from turboprop operations to a jet aircraft. In turboprops, certain types of snow may blow off during takeoff. But jet aircraft are far more sensitive to contamination. The difference is not obvious unless it is deeply understood and reinforced through training. And in this case, that understanding was not strong enough to override instinct. So the final cause of the accident was defined as a loss of lift due to wing contamination. But the contributing factors extended far beyond that. They included inadequate training, poor maintenance practices, incorrect application of operational rules, lack of proper oversight, and a safety culture that allowed risk to accumulate unnoticed. It was not a single failure. It was a system that had slowly drifted away from safe operation. This investigation became one of the most comprehensive in aviation history. The final report spanned thousands of pages and included testimony from hundreds of witnesses. But its true impact was not in the volume of information. It was in the shift of perspective it created. For the first time, an investigation focused not just on what happened, but on why the system allowed it to happen. This led to major changes in aviation safety. Independent investigation bodies were established to ensure that accidents would be examined without conflict of interest. Training standards were strengthened, especially for transitions between aircraft types. Minimum equipment lists were standardized and strictly enforced. And most importantly, the concept of safety culture became central to how airlines operate. The lessons from this accident extended beyond aviation. They influenced how organizations in many industries think about risk and accountability. The idea that accidents are rarely caused by a single error, but rather by a chain of systemic failures, became widely accepted. And this understanding has since been used to prevent countless incidents before they occur. But even with these changes, the story does not end here, because just a few years later, another aircraft of the same type crashed under similar conditions. Snow and ice again played a role. And once again, questions were raised about how quickly lessons are implemented across the industry. This reminds us that safety is not something that can be achieved once and then forgotten. It requires constant attention and continuous improvement. So what does this mean for aviation today? It means that every procedure exists for a reason. Every checklist item is a layer of protection. And every decision made in the cockpit is supported by a system designed to keep that decision safe. But when that system weakens, even the most experienced crew can find themselves in a situation where the right choice is no longer clear. The legacy of Flight 136-3 is not just about what went wrong. It is about what was learned. It is about recognizing that safety depends on more than individual skill. It depends on the strength of the entire system. And it is about understanding that preventing the next accident begins long before the aircraft reaches the runway. If stories like this make you look at aviation differently, and you want to keep exploring the hidden layers behind these investigations, then make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. There are many more cases where the truth is not obvious at first glance, and every one of them reveals something new about how complex and fragile safety can be when it is taken for granted.